So welcome to today's event. You are in for a treat. Experimentation 201 with Sami Horn, Dr. Sami Horn. Let's learn about Sami. She started her behavioral science career in Nairobi over 9 years ago, where she led projects tackling a variety of challenges from increasing uptake of iron supplements in North India to understanding the drivers of civic participation in Uganda. Since then, her work has focused on applying behavioral economics to health-related questions, both as a researcher and applied behavioral scientist. Her research has been published in Nature, PNAS, and other journals spanning a broad range of disciplines. Now, this is my favorite part about Sami's bio. She is a wonderful and interesting person, but she also makes you feel like whatever degrees you got aren't cool enough. So just wait for this one, because she has a PhD in social and decision sciences, and she's driven by an interest in using AI to boost the impact of behavioral science interventions in healthcare. But then she also has a master's in machine learning from Carnegie Mellon University as well. But she also has an MA in International Development Economics from Yale. And I love this sentence, due to a youthful desire to hang out in libraries reading Latin poetry, which we should probably make you recite ad nauseum for the next 15 minutes. She has a BA in Classics from King's College London. And before focusing on behavioral science, Sami had held various roles at Cathay Pacific Airlines. I did not know this until today. This is fascinating. Across South and East Asia, and started her career at a large investment bank as an analyst. So that was a lot of ado. So there will be no more further ado. I will admit some people. We will stop the sharing. Let's give Sami a killer round of applause, virtual or otherwise. Take it away, Sami. Tell us about how to run the experiments.
Okay, thanks, Ryan, for that intro. I felt intimidating enough when I heard that I was between Dan and Todd, and then listening to your bio before speaking in detail hasn't really helped. So thanks everyone for coming today. As Ryan mentioned, we're going to do a bit of a deep dive on experimentation. And we're just going to cover some tips on how to run reliable experiments, a lot based on good practice, but then also what I've seen go wrong for me and for others over the years. But first, I just wanted to understand what brings you to experiments today, just so I can kind of try and tailor to where you're at. I think that there's stuff that's relevant for everyone in these buckets, but if you could just drop in the chat whether you're in A, you're just curious, B, you're running experiments a lot, C, you manage, or maybe you work next to people who run them and you just want to learn more, or D, you're sort of about to start running them and you want to know what can go wrong. Okay, awesome. Seeing a lot of Ds, not much curiosity on a Friday, I understand that. B, Cs. Okay, great. That's really helpful. So I am also aware that experiments is not the most exciting topic probably for one of these Friday things. It's not as exciting as learning about behavioral science and dating apps. So I do want to make this collaborative. So if you have questions that come up, I'm going to pause at different points for questions. But if you're like, oh, that's kind of confusing, or does this mean X? Then please put that in the chat and we can break and have a conversation, because I think that's probably what's most valuable here. Okay, so I'm going to start with a general overview of why we experiment, and then go into 10 tips for running experiments, things that might go wrong and how you can guard against them. And then if we have time, I just wanted to touch on a few topics beyond experiments, but we'll see how we go. So first, at a high level, why do we want to experiment? So one big reason is that you have to do something, you have to take some action, and you don't know which works best. So you're in some period of uncertainty, and you just want to help get a recommendation of what to do. The second is that maybe you have a great and really creative idea. I think this is very much the case with behavioral interventions. You sort of see something work in the literature and you're like, oh, that could be really exciting to my product, but it involves an engineering or maybe sort of a staffing change, and you want to see whether it's worth it. Experiments are a really great way to get some data to see whether it's cost effective to make a change that you're excited about. And the third one, and this is less about working out the impact of something, but experiments can be a really great way to work out what's a barrier to use. So really help you learn more about your users. So you might have some barrier, some idea of like why someone's not using a product. For example, maybe someone's not using digital therapy because of stigma or because of beliefs about the efficacy of online therapy. and you want to run an experiment to unpack that, and then you can go back to 1 and 2 and develop an intervention around it. So I only have really one slide on how experiments work. I think the one thing to remember with experiments is that what you want is 2 different groups, A and B, and you really want them to only differ in the treatments. You want to be able to look at what group A is doing and what group B is doing and say, okay, well, the only thing that's changing these 2 groups is the treatment. You want to make sure they have the same income, the same gardening habits, the same levels of present bias, the same preferences for Coca-Cola, the same purchasing behavior. You want to make sure that's the same across groups. Everything is the same, and the only thing that's varying is the treatment. And this is where randomization is really kind of amazing, because with large enough samples, it's going to make sure that you're the same on all these different metrics, and the only thing that's changing is the treatment. I think that's really the beauty of randomization and sort of randomized control trials or A/B tests. So you may be wondering sort of when experiments are relevant compared to different research approaches. Obviously, user research is really popular, pilot testing at a slightly larger scale, and then ultimately experiments require a lot more investment. So why would they be useful? So qual interviews, they're quicker, they're smaller sample, and they're more flexible. So if you sort of see something that's interesting in a qual interview, it's easy to change track and sort of get more information about that. Whereas experiments, they're much larger samples. Their results are kind of more rigorous. They have more validity because of the larger sample, but they're also a lot more fixed. So you're really looking at one specific question. So I think that qual interviews are really there for generating hypotheses, and then experiments are there to test them. I think it's not experiments or qual interviews. I think these things work together in a cycle, and they can build on each other. But the thing with experiments is that they can go very wrong. It's quite hard for a qualitative interview to go terribly wrong, and it's possible if you had a very rude interviewer, or you just can't find anyone to interview, but it's pretty difficult for it to be an absolute disaster. It's quite possible for an experiment to go completely wrong. So this brings us to the next section, where we're really going to dig into 10 tips for running experiments. And I'm going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions at any point in these tips, please shout out. Okay, so at a high level, what do you need to do to run an experiment? The first thing is to set a question. What is it that you want to test in the experiment? The second thing is to create test conditions. So what is A going to do and what is B going to do? That could be a screen in an app, or it could be a complete protocol. It could be that someone's going to a misinformation training, and then they're going to have an opportunity to sort of sign up for a course, and then you're going to look at outcomes much later. So it really could be anything, but ultimately you want to design the protocols that one group's going to go through and one group's going to be, oh, my audio is bad. Interesting. Let me take off my AirPods. Hang on. Is that true for everyone? You can't hear me?
No, we can hear you. It's just a little bit crackly.
Okay, let me take it off. Sorry, you're going to have to
That's okay.
go through this.
This is an exciting interlude, at which point people in the chat might say, hey, what's the most interesting
experiment
you've seen? Yeah, that is a lot better. It's much crisper. Yeah.
That's better?
Yeah.
Okay, well, no, this is a really great point to be able to hear me, because the first stuff was more intro. So I'm glad that you can now hear me. Okay, awesome. So where did I get to? Yeah, the next thing is to determine sample size. So you want to work out how many people are going in your experiment, and we're going to go into these in more detail. The next is to do the beautiful thing of randomize people. Then you want to record outcomes. You want to see what they're actually doing. You want to analyze the data, see what happened, and ultimately interpret findings. So I have 10 tips that are going to go across all these different parts. The first thing is, hopefully the simplest thing, is to create test conditions. So tip 1 is to only change what you care about. So you really want to only change the thing that you are interested in seeing the impact of across experimental conditions, because you want to see if that thing works at scale. I think there's a tendency, less so in really simple experiments, but with more complex experiments, is you sort of want to pile on a lot of different things to make something work. And that can be very valid if you want to see whether this whole package works. But for instance, here, this is 2 emails from ClassPass. You can see they're varying the image, they're varying the subject line, they're varying the copy.
So, I mean, I don't know what their intention was with this, but if, say, this one worked more than the other, it would be hard to know what to go for at scale. Whereas if they had run something like this, where really they're just changing the subject line and the copy and the image is the same, it can be a little bit easier to build on that learning and then change things sequentially. So the tip here is to make sure that your interventions really just differ on the thing that you care about testing. Okay, I have a question. Where do you recommend defining what a successful experiment? Yes, this is a great question. We're going to get to that under analyzing data, because I agree that it's really important with experiments to stop, essentially p-hacking or finding something working when it's not working, but we will get there. We can have a chat about it then. Okay, so the next thing is to determine sample size. There's two things to think about with sample size. First is that you want to set the target sample size in advance. So you want to sort of go into the experiment saying that we're aiming to recruit whatever it is, 1,000 people, and we're going to stop the experiment at that point. If you, I don't know if anyone has done this, but when I started running experiments, you're really excited, there's data coming in, and you're sort of checking it maybe every day to see if it's working. And it's sort of, it's a bit of a disappointing roller coaster, because it's going to be pretty sensitive to the sample, because it's a pretty small sample, it's going to be pretty sensitive early on. So you might see an experiment working when it only has 10% of the sample. And people tend to be very tempted to stop the experiment then. You've got a result. Why would I want to risk that with more people? But it's really important to run the experiment through to whatever sample size you were thinking about, because if you stop it early, just because you see it's working, you're going to end up biasing your results. The second important thing is to make sure that your sample size is large enough. So if your sample is too small, and by small, it really depends on the effect that you're looking for, but let's just say something, under 100 per arm is really very, very small. So if you have a really small sample, you're going to risk seeing unreliable results. So if you do see an effect, it's more likely to be just spurious. And more importantly, you're going to risk not seeing a result that's actually there. So you might have some, intervention that you think really works. And if you're not running sufficient sample size with it, so enough people, you're going to miss kind of innovating or changing a product when actually something is worth investing in. And there are some online tools that can help you find the right sample size. I think if you're working with other people running experiments, it's just a really nice question to ask, sort of, how did you get to this sample size? How did you decide to pick this number? I think a lot of these tips, even if you're not running experiments yourself, if you're managing people who do experiments, or you go to meetings where there's experiments, this is kind of an important question to ask others. Okay, let's see this comment. Okay, I'll pause at the end to go into these more in-depth ones. So this is really a lesson from experience or a failed experiment, is to check that random is actually random. So it's quite tempting to rely on existing user IDs to randomize people. So for example, to say, oh, we know this user ID was assigned randomly. We want to give people with 0 to 4 treatment and 5 to 9 control, and that's just the easiest way for us to do it. I'd worked with a very large tech company who I won't name, but this experiment involved millions of users, and we were looking at ways to increase charitable donation. So we did it based on user ID. So we said, if you're 0 to 4, you're going to be in control, 5 to 9 treatment. It looked random, and that it looked like the same number of people were in each bucket, which reassured us. And then we got the results back, and the intervention had a huge positive impact. It was really effective. And I believe in behavioral science for charitable giving, but this was just a little suspicious. And I went back to look at the differences before we started the treatment, and they were still different. And to me, it was a bit of a sanity check, because I thought this company, I think they are an impressive company, but I wasn't sort of I wasn't asking as many questions as maybe you would with a different partner. But what happened for some reason, this was in 2017, is that during 2016, IDs weren't random. So for some reason, some bug in the ID generation code, 6s and 7s were way more popular in 2016 than any other year. So this meant that the treatment group was essentially more recent users than the control group, which just ruined the entire experiment. So I think the advice here is to triple check that the IDs are uniform if you want to randomize that on ID, but it would be better practice to just create a new variable or just randomize within the product than relying on an existing ID. Can learn from my mistakes here. The other thing that's less dramatic is to randomize the right users. So, it's important to select users from the population you care about to make sure that your experimental results are going to generalize. So it's sort of easier to say, oh, it's simpler to run our experiment with this group of users or maybe with this geography than it is the entire geography. But sometimes it's just worth the investment to run it with the whole user pool that you care about, because it's very hard, really impossible to work out whether the results you see in one geography or with one group are going to translate to other types of people. There are methods, but they're all essentially just based on prediction. It's not as clean as just pulling users from the geography you care about. So I think if someone says, oh, it's easier to do it in a certain group, it's worth pushing back a little and trying to pull users really from the population that you care about. Okay, so the next tip is on recording outcomes. So it's very easy to focus on the people in the experiment who did the thing that you want them to do and forget the people who didn't do the thing you were looking at. So this is sort of an imaginary A/B test from Headspace, for some reason with UK pricing. So imagine that they were running a sort of comparison between A versus B. And they were trying to shift people into annual pricing. This is quite common. People seem to make more money when you go into annual pricing. So they're showing in one condition, the sort of monthly versus annual. And in, say, group B, imagine that they add a little social norms prompt. So they say 60% of users choose this. And they want to see which of these interventions increases the number of people moving into annual pricing. So I think what's a very natural thing to do is to say, okay, well, among the people who paid, annual, 25% of people chose annual here and 30% of people chose annual here. So you're like, amazing, it works. People who are paying are moving more into annual. But if we look to the other side of it and we were to consider people who didn't pay at all, then this percentage looks very different. It's actually a negative treatment effect when you take into account the people who did neither. So here you're moving from sort of 20% to 15%. And the lesson here is to make sure that everybody who was assigned a condition ends up in your analysis or ends up in that average that you're creating. And it might be that they are dropping out because they're not paying, or it could be that they're dropping out because they get bored of your product and they drop off, or maybe they're more likely in a policy setting to move state because of an intervention. You want to include everybody who was initially randomized in your analysis, because not including people means that all those beautiful guarantees of randomization are just lost. Any questions on this? I'll keep running through tips, and then I'm going to pause at the end because I know this is a lot of information and we can go to individual questions. Okay, the next thing is analyzing data. I assume, who has heard of p-hacking in life? Yeah, it's terrible, but very common. I was almost had a slide about motivated reasoning to bring in some behavioral science, but I found this XKCD cartoon instead, which is a bit blurred on the right. So this, I don't know if you know XKCD. It's a kind of nerdy stats comic. I think some of them are great. But essentially what they're saying here is that they're looking at a link between different colored jelly beans and acne. So they test purple jelly beans, they test brown jelly beans, pink, blue, teal, gray, tan, cyan, keep going. And eventually they find a link between green jelly beans and acne. And there we go. We have the Daily Mail headline. So in a work-based setting, I think this is pretty common. So you're like, oh, there's no effect. Oh, but maybe it just works for this different outcome. Maybe it's not about annual, it's about kind of annual and then renewing again. It's not working. well, I guess it probably works more for like regular users. So what if I look at regular users and there you go, you end up with a result that works. Basically, if you just ask more questions, run more hypotheses, you're going to find something that works. And, you know, I think p-hacking sounds kind of evil. I think this is sort of it can be, but it's sort of a natural, unfortunate process where you're curious, you've run this huge experiment, maybe it took months, maybe it was a lot of money, and you want to find something that works, and you're telling yourself that, oh, this is real, you know, I just didn't plan it properly. Was in reality, you're trying to find something that's working. So the real only way I would say to guard against this is to create a pre-analysis plan. So in academia, this is all very detailed. I don't think it has to be very detailed. I think it should just be an agreement among your colleagues, or like an internal, even like 4-line Excel sheet that just says like, what's the research question? What's the sample size? Who's going to be included? Like, what's the outcome and how am I going to analyze it? Like just 5 lines. And that could be within your team an agreement. It could be something that someone ran an experiment. It's just like, you know, putting on paper. And then I also think it's what's nice about a pre-analysis plan, I find, is that it can be hard to think through all the things that can go wrong in an experiment, or even realize that you and another researcher or another colleague are looking for something totally different. So just laying this out helps guard against p-hacking, but also creates more focused experiments, which I think is really helpful. Okay, lastly, last 3 tips. I do feel like this is quite a lot for if you're on the East Coast Friday afternoon. But essentially, it's important to check for outliers in your analysis. So, you know, if you're going to make a large product change, you don't want that to be based on the behavior of sort of 1% of users who are behaving very weirdly. So large samples should help remove the impact of outliers. But you want to check that any kind of average effect or any change between treatment and control is driven by, you know, the majority of people and not a very small, unusual group of people. This is another obvious opportunity for p-hacking. You know, if I say like, oh, you know, my results hold if I remove the top 10% of people, you don't want to get into that. But it is worth checking for outliers and making a plan of how you're going to deal with outliers in advance. So that you can be more confident that the results are robust. The other thing is to check for noise. I really don't think there's any need to understand what a p-value is in life, because ultimately you just look at the number. So I think the p-value is just, if it's low, great, results are unlikely to be a chance. So, you know, if it's less than say 0.05, and then it ranges to 1, and if it's, you know, near a 1, it's more likely to be chance. It's really just a measure of how likely your results are to be driven by chance, or how rare it would be to see an effect like this in a world where there was actually no effect. So I think there's some debate, and it'd be actually really interesting to hear your all views on the relevance of p-values in business. I think some companies go really like double down on p-values or like statistical significance, because it is a nice heuristic. And it's obviously like helpful to know if something is from chance or not, but then I know other organizations just think it's just too much. So I'm very curious actually to hear more about how you all kind of include statistical significance in the studies that you're doing. There's a question on a statistical definition of an outlier. There's no statistical definition of an outlier. It's really just depends on the outcome you're working with and what you want to plan in advance. So it's really like, what would you be comfortable with driving your results? So it's pretty common to say like, we'll just check that the results hold, removing the top 5% of people, but there's no like specific number that means like this is an outlier. Because for some, you think for some interventions that you might be really happy, this might be the outcome that you really care about, right? Like say, I don't know, like you're trying to get a small percent of people to like fly to Australia, and most people are flying domestically, and you offer an incentive to fly to Australia, and this is like miles flown, you get this, you're like, it's not an outlier, right? That's your treatment. So it really depends on what your data is doing. So if this, for instance, is like, it's too low, but like say number of calories eaten for breakfast, and what you're doing in the treatment is changing like this, 5% of people are just eating like a lot for breakfast, that's not telling you that the intervention is working for most people. Okay, and then the last tip is really to check for meaning. So I think there's a lot of psychology around running experiments, but ultimately they take a lot of time. So people tend to get very excited about things that work, me included. You're like, aha, I've worked on this for 3 months and, I improved something by 0.5% and it's statistically significant. Great. I think the question as managers or organizations you want to ask is, okay, like you saw something work, but what does this actually mean in terms of revenue and cost? Is this investment worth it, right? You're not just looking for statistical significance. You're not just looking for what works. It's important to map this in to ultimate implications for the company or for the product. And I think it's actually worth asking people running experiments to do this work for you, because I think there's a tendency to come with it improved by 1 percentage point. What does that mean? I don't know what it means. So I think bringing that mapping into actual meaning for the product is really important. Okay, so just as an overview, I think this step-by-step still holds with the inclusion of a pre-analysis plan, but ultimately, just as an overview, you want to set an experimental question, you want to create test conditions where you're only changing the thing you care about. You then want to decide on the sample size, you want to agree on that in advance, and you want to make sure it's large enough so that you're able to see an effect if it's there. You then want to make sure that you are actually randomizing and you're randomizing the right people. You want to record outcomes for everybody who was randomized. And then I think you want to use a pre-analysis plan or at least some kind of agreement to avoid p-hacking or just someone finding results all the time. And then when you're looking at findings, you want to check for outliers, you want to check for noise, and you want to check for meaning. I found this, in terms of what to expect, quite a sobering quote from Ron Kohavi on Lenny's podcast. It's kind of a lot of text, so I'll read it. Basically, he said that at Airbnb is the fact that we ran some 250 experiments in my tenure, and I'm sure he's very, very good at running experiments. And again, small improvements added up. So this became overall 6% improvement to revenue. That's great. But he says of these experiments, 92% failed to improve the metric we were trying to move. So only 8% of our ideas were actually successful at moving these key metrics. And he has similar statistics, I think, at Microsoft as well. So I think the lesson here is that a lot of experiments just don't work. It is quite hard to move these outcomes, but running a lot of experiments, you can see improvements, but it's important not to get disheartened. So I'm going to pause before moving on to other topics to ask for questions in the chat, because I do think this is not the most invigorating material for a Friday, but hopefully it's you're learning something. And if you have questions about sort of experiments you're running or thinking you're running, I'm very happy for this kind of part to just be an office hours. So feel free to put your hand up or drop questions in the chat.
No, this is great. Lucas, did you have a question that you wanted to put in the chat? You sent it to me individually, or even do you want to come off mic to ask? That's a maybe.
My microphone's not working.
No, we hear you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry because it said.
Oh,
I apologize. Yeah, I think one of the things is just about using some platforms like Amplitude or Optimizely to help you design and run experiments. If you don't if your team doesn't have the native skill set to do this, any thoughts on which platforms work well and just in terms of ease of use?
Yeah, that's a great question. How do you actually run these experiments? So I'm not familiar with the different platforms for running experiments for. I think they're mainly for marketing communication. I'm sure for that example, platforms are really helpful. I think I was speaking to my partner before this who does sort of in-app testing. I think a lot of experiments, on apps or, large experiments for websites, they do require some engineering build out. So in that sense, it's sort of helpful to have engineering support. And then, I don't think that experiments have to be limited to sort of, emails, marketing. For instance, I've worked with health insurance companies and there's no platform, to run an experiment. It's really like randomizing if nurses make this kind of call or that kind of call. And they're really, you sort of just want like a Google form or a Google sheet that just tracks what each patient is. So I don't think there has to be like an investment in a platform necessarily, though if you end up running a lot of experiments, it's quite helpful. But it can be lower tech products if it's more of sort of a field type study. But I'm interested if other people have ideas on platforms. On MTurk, yeah, so I mean, I've done a lot of tests, sort of off-product tests on MTurk and Prolific. I think Prolific actually has slightly better sample right now. They're a bit more attentive, and they have sort of better regulation of their pool. Yeah, I didn't speak about that. I do think, if you're considering if it's worth running a test in product, which obviously requires some sort of engineering changes, maybe you want to run a test with a different sample. So a sample that's more controllable offline. So how does that work? So Prolific is sort of just a pool of people taking surveys all day, every day. So you can just set up a survey in Qualtrics or, on a Google form where you would give people, say, one screen versus another screen. You can randomize and see if that works with that sample. Obviously, the cost of that sample is external validity. So you can't say like, oh, do you sign up? Because people aren't actually signing up. But I think it's a really great way to just sanity check whether your intervention is working like you think it is, and whether you're likely to get a lift. So I would say on Prolific, you want to be seeing a really large lift on the outcome that you're looking at. And we can speak more about Prolific studies and how you can make them more realistic, so that then in product, it's going to be a lot smaller.
We have a question from Tiziana. She wants to know if you can use the current state of affairs as a basic condition and intervention as the second group. I think that's a question.
Yeah, definitely. So you definitely don't have to change things in, if we're talking in A/B terms, sort of in group A and group B. I think that's the original version of A/B tests, is the randomized controlled trials, and very much often in healthcare, the control is just the status quo, right? Usual care, and then treatment is the thing that you're really intervening on and maybe doing a lot on. So definitely, you can build from status quo, and I think that's particularly relevant. I think in communication, it's easier to test a lot of different things, but if you have a process. For example, sort of like, sign into a doctor's office, you do really want to compare versus the status quo. So I definitely think the status quo is a really great counterfactual.
That's great. And I guess as we look forward here, if you have any additional questions, just the friendly reminder, put them in the chat. We're a nice sized group today, so it's easy to take these from the chat. So don't be shy. Use your question mark key as we go forward. So thanks, Sami.
Okay, the baseline question. Yeah, the baseline is really interesting. So in field studies, for a long time, there was a tendency to take this formulaic approach of I measure outcomes at baseline, I randomize, and then I measure at end line, and I look to the change. So then I think it's like, I see, but the baseline is not about initial outcomes. It's more about like, sorry, just to understand the question, it's about what is the comparison group? If you don't have a status quo. Okay, so in that world, it's really you have to pick something to test it against, right? So the most obvious alternative is something that's like cheapest, simplest, because really the experiment is telling you whether it's something that's worth the investment. So I would say you go with the easiest thing to do. And then you want to see if you can beat that baseline, right? Like, why is the status quo a baseline? It's a baseline because it's just the easiest thing to do. And you want to understand if it's worth moving away from that. So I think, if you're like, oh, I don't know what marketing communication to send, you could either test like 5 different options against each other. I also think it's not always like the randomized control trial idea is like, I want to see if treatment beats control. Experiments can just be used to say, I have 5 different ideas of what I should include in this copy, and I want to see which one works best, right? Like, I think it's social norms, someone else thinks it's loss aversion. We want to run these against each other. It can be more of a horse race than a, does this beat this? Okay, let's do this next question. Yeah, it's a really good question. So the next question is saying, like, almost, if say you're just starting up as an organization and you want to run an experiment to see if your product is working, do you just run it anyway? And take the results with a pinch of salt. I think so. Sometimes there can be a lot of pressure from funders to prove impact, but I think it's quite risky to run an experiment where you don't have the pieces in place to actually show impact. So I think that in the initial stages, things like feasibility tests, like qualitative research, pilots, like proof of concept are much more important than a full-scale experiment. I think experiments, depending on the product, like I was working with a community health worker group, and they were pressured to show results, and they didn't have the program yet to do that. And I think that organizations who wait to run the experiment do better, as long as you're getting some data on how it's working along the way. Because the thing is, if you have a bad experimental result and that's like public in any way, it's very hard to back down from that. So I think it's important to be patient with impact evaluations and run them when you really believe in the product, because if it's really, the experiment is there to help you learn something. And if you run it and you're like, oh, it's a null, it didn't work. Well, I didn't think it was going to work anyway. Was it really worth the investment in doing that? I would say probably not. When do you uptake? Okay, I can come back to that. What's the question on Bayesian bootstrapping context?
Oh yeah, I was just wondering, in the context where you don't necessarily have a p-value, so it's a little bit like more difficult to account for like the sample that you want, like when you would go about stopping like a Bayesian A/B test.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a split in statistics as to whether you're a frequentist or a Bayesian person. I've like never really run experiments not with a p-value.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I was just curious if you have any knowledge. They're totally cool if not. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've done some work, and this was going to be one of the more like next topics if we got there, on adaptive experiments, which are more Bayesian in nature, but there the stopping rules are very well defined. And actually, even in the Bayesian, like, oh, okay, I might. So yeah, there are some study designs where I say, like, I'm gonna base my stopping rule on the data, but they're very much designed in a way that's guarding against your type 1 error, which is what you're trying to do, or what you're worried about if you stop early. So I think it's like a different, and to me, not necessarily more helpful way of analyzing experiments.
Cool. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Could you avoid issues that come with p-hacking by accounting for the extra conditions? Okay, so yeah, these are definitely more in-depth questions. So one thing, I mean, if we actually go back to the jelly beans, right? The jelly bean example is not so different from an experiment where you're running 20 different arms against each other. So I don't know if you've seen the Katie Milkman sort of like mega studies for behavioral science approach, that paper. I mean, essentially, she takes, I'm on that paper, so I feel like I can probably criticize it, but that takes ideas from lots of different behavioral scientists as to what's going to improve exercise. There's 50 arms. It's a lot of arms. And essentially in the paper, there's a graph that says, we're going to look at we're going to track how, which of these arms is successful. This ends up looking a lot like this problem, right? I'm testing 50 things. Some of these are going to work. Some of these are not going to work. So then what you need to do is basically just reduce essentially your p-value. Where's my p-value slide? Your p-value, so that it's lower. So the threshold is no longer like 0.05, because this, with 20 experiments, you're going to get one of them working. You want to make it lower. And there's ways for it to be lower in a way that's not very punitive. But essentially, that's just something to guard against. That you don't want to be, you want to make sure that you're not running an experiment that looks like this. And if you are, you want to be able to change the threshold a little.
Awesome. That's super helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Do you have any tips around Oh, Erin, do you want to give a bit more detail on that? I don't think I know what that is.
Sure. So the methodology is, I think, similar to what you may think of as a proof of concept, where you put stimuli in front of the participant that describes what the feature could be, but it isn't real yet, and you're asking them to interact with it, not in a qualitative fashion, but in a quantitative setting. And in terms of any tips around that you talked about related today, in terms of what you can measure, anything that you can think of.
So it's sort of like a prototyping experiment. Is that?
Yeah, you can think of it like that. There's no code. It's just HTML and CSS in front of the customer.
Interesting. But they're not actually coming to it as a customer. You're sort of asking them to imagine that they're in this setting where they're seeing this.
So actually the environment in which I'm presenting it to them is I'm interrupting them in their normal product experience by trying to get them to come and respond to a particular stimuli. So let's say they're inside our app already using it, and I hook them to look at something.
But are you running it as an A/B test, or you just sort of want to get feedback from that?
Yeah, it's not an A/B test. It's a little similar to what Nina asked earlier, where we're looking to see if there might be value in building something new. And so I don't really have a baseline to compare.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess the things like the tips that would be relevant there are probably focused around like generalizability, right? Like you want to maybe check that the people coming into this, other test are representative of your users. Like I feel like that would be my main concern, that you're getting a slightly different type of person who is willing to do this, these different screens. And I think that's actually where incentives for participation, although expensive, can be helpful, because if you look at the samples that like opt in to spending extra work, they do tend to be a bit skewed in demographics versus your overall demographic pool. So in a way, I wonder, like, I don't know if this is the kind of thing you're thinking about, like, can you target specific users and maybe even give like more of an incentive to people to come in who would be like less likely to select in normally? I think the generalizability, and then the analysis is obviously like very, very different, but it sounds like you're getting enough sample size that you can look for kind of like segments or like correlations, which actually I think the p-hacking thing is also very relevant too, right? Like you can look at, if you look at 10 different correlations, it's going to have the same issue. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
It is. Thank you.
Great. What is this? As much as skin in the game. Any tips to make the respondents feel more? Yeah. Okay, so this is a good question. The question is, when you're running an out of product experiment on Prolific, people don't really care, right? So if you're you're asking, does this change in, say, onboarding flow or information increase the likelihood to sign up for digital therapy or digital therapy app, right? So people in Prolific are not, if you ask a question like, would you sign up? They're not really they don't really care, right? They can just say yes, no. These outcomes become very noisy and they can be hard to infer from. I think there's probably two things, one that's really light touch, one that's high touch. The first one is that you kind of want to like lead people into the scenario. So you just want to imagine like what it's like to be a Prolific person is kind of what it's like to be an app user, right? They're just sitting there at their computer and suddenly you show them a screen and you ask them some questions, they're not going to pay attention. So you sort of want to like bring them into the scenario, which just increases engagement, but that's obviously a very like qualitative way of doing it. You want to remove demand effects. So there's a concern that the survey taker is just going to tell you what you want to hear, right? And that is often correlated with treatment and control. So say treatment, you're like, oh, digital therapy works for, millions of people, and in control, you're not saying that. do you want to sign up? In treatment, they're really gonna just say yes in line with the treatment. So you're going to get a treatment effect on prolific, but actually the person's just telling you what you want to hear. So you sort of want to not run experiments where that's the case. The way that like researchers do to get around this is to have some money on the line. So I know someone, for example, who said, we're going to give $100 of digital therapy to 1 out of 100, say, or 1 out of 200 prolific users, right? We are going to do this. Do you want the $100 in digital therapy, or do you want the $100 in Amazon vouchers, right? So but you're not giving it to everybody. Obviously, they'd be really expensive, but you say you have some 1% chance of getting this. Or you say, you have $200, and with 1% probability, I'm going to implement your choice. How much do you want to pay for a single therapy session? So these things put money on the line in a way that makes people less likely to just tell you what they want to hear. But the important thing is to not give it to everybody, because then it becomes very expensive.
So Sami, I just want to interject. I don't know how many slides you have left, and we're at the 10-minute mark. So I just want you to kind of choose accordingly.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I was thinking that it would be most useful, particularly as it's a Friday and it's on experiments, to spend most of the time answering questions. But I'll just go, the only few things that I thought would be useful for questions or comments, if we didn't have any of that, it's been great to have this level of chat, and we can go back to some of these questions afterwards, is I think if you're running experiments, it's really helpful. And this is also with quantitative data, right? It doesn't have to be an A/B test, but to elicit predictions from your team, from your managers, from people, from other people in the company as to what's going to be the case, because we have this curse of knowledge, right? It's very easy for something to be run, and then your manager or another team be like, oh yeah, well, I didn't think that was going to work anyway. And that kind of invalidates people's faith in experiments. Whereas if you just get predictions, do you think this is going to work? Do you think this is not going to work? I think that helps create a culture of experiments, right? Because people then realize like, oh, I was wrong. Like this was a useful thing to do. And it's so easy once you've seen the data to just explain it away as if you knew it. The second thing, and this is already relating to what Shay was saying, is there's other ways to run experiments, particularly in cases where you have like 20 different things you want to test. You don't have to just randomize across all. You can kind of assign based on how successful they're looking over time, but it is a bit complicated in a way, but it's something to dig into if you're ever in a situation where you're like, oh, we want to test which one of these 50 things works. I think adaptive experiments can be really helpful. And the last thing we haven't really spoken about actually is heterogeneity, right? So you might want to know, okay, like, did this experiment work well for regular users or lower income people, or does it work differently for men and women? You don't want to have too many of these questions because it ends up in sort of a p-hacking risk. But I do think like you can get a lot more out of your experiments if you look at these kind of questions. And then I also think, somewhat relatedly, like even if your experiment doesn't work, you're going to get such rich descriptives that it's worth just kind of pulling out of that data, not in terms of p-hacking, but any kind of descriptives that you didn't have before. Because I don't know, like if you have a hard time persuading others to run experiments, but I do think that there can be this idea of, oh, we don't learn much, it's too hard. But the more insights you're pulling from one experiment, I think, the more persuasive it can be internally. But that's all I was going to add. So we can definitely go back to a couple of questions. And thank you. And happy randomizing. Had to do that with a American Z, but it looks better.
No, that's great. I just wasn't sure how much content there was. So we do have some great questions in the chat if you want to take those.
Do we end on the hour, or is there a return to sort of like what's coming up in terms of Dan next week?
No, this crew, they know everything. So and now you just said Dan's next week, so we're golden. Dan's next week. No, so we go to the top of the hour.
Okay, awesome. I got a bit lost.
Well, one of the questions was about how you're using AI in healthcare.
It's a great question, and it's in my bio, so it should be there. I think I was excited about the intersection of AI and behavioral science, really kind of on the experimentation side. So essentially, what I am like partly working on from a research perspective is how do we it's really back to this heterogeneity point. How do we target behavioral interventions for people so that the right intervention is going for the person who it works best for? I think what we're learning with behavioral science is that, that of course there are these average effects, like social norms do work, but like different things work for different people. And I think machine learning is really good at identifying who things are working well for, but then it's kind of a question of how do you predict which person is that person, right? Do I need to know your shopping behavior? Do I need to know, can I just ask one question? What do I need to ask to know what to send, which intervention to send you? So that's one. And the second thing, which is much more recent, I actually didn't study things like ChatGPT. ChatGPT came out at the end of my master's, so I feel like I should have opted into more of these large language model courses. But I'm really fascinated with how hard it is for people to get information on Google, particularly health information, and how ChatGPT or large language models can make that a lot easier, especially if you think of this. I did a study where we're looking at misinformation and whether people, when incentivized, can actually get correct health information on Google. I'm sure that you're all very versed in behavioral science. If you look at Google, I mean, that's such a difficult interface to pull information from. You have so much choice. So thinking about how things like ChatGPT can summarize that information is what I'm focusing on.
Awesome. And then Wes had another question there about running experience with B2B products, where you're trying to control for the contextual influences that users experience using the product. For example, pressure from their boss or team to behave in a certain way.
That's interesting. So, there's the beauty of experiments is that it's going to be, you don't need to control for it. It's going to be the same across groups. You do sometimes analytically want to control for things that are going to reduce noise, but let's just say that's constant across groups. So it's not a problem, but I think this goes to the heterogeneity where you might be, if you're seeing repeatedly some null result and you're I suspect that it's only working for this certain type of people, right? It's only working for organizations where there's a lot of buy-in or there's not this pressure or whatever it is, then you just want to measure that at baseline. So when you start the experiment, you have some measure of which organization falls into which bucket. And then, I mean, you can look at whether the treatment effect is stronger for these people. You can also just run the experiment with these people, right? I think that's what I would say. It seems like you have a problem in that you suspect that the product's not working for a lot of people. So then when you average out, you're not seeing anything. But if you could make it more targeted or look afterwards by some variable, then I think you would have a better chance to see something.
Oh, looks like Shay had one last question. Come on the mic, Shay.
Sure. Last question I had, which I think is less nerdy. Apologies for the last ones. I was curious if you feel like you can identify user personas through seeing heterogeneous treatment effects after analysis of an experiment, or if it's generally a little harder to discern than that. I think kind of a clear narrative.
Shay's question is like an oral defense of a. I think it's an interesting question. Do I think I can identify user personas? So I don't spend as much time thinking about user personas, and I think that the way that it's done in marketing is to kind of use some clustering algorithm and pull out general users. I would say, and maybe this is a broader point, that if you're running a larger experiment, for example, I'm running an experiment on a misinformation intervention in Sierra Leone. So we're doing a training, and we think that this is going to change people's use of the formal healthcare sector. So obviously that's a little bit of a intervention to outcome is a bit longer, but there's a few plausible paths, right? It could be that you just have more trust, you distrust online WhatsApp more. There's these different paths. So what we're doing is measuring these different paths and then seeing which of these are changing. So I think it's more when you say user personas, I think the experiments can be used to identify mechanism, and that can be really helpful, because otherwise we might invest a lot of time in I don't know, like reducing trust in social media when actually all the treatment effect is going through something like, okay, I no longer Google something, I now ask a healthcare provider. So I would say like for those big experiments, I think it's less relevant for like A/B tests. You want to be measuring stuff that's telling you why something's changing, because then that tells you where to invest. But thank you for the question. All these questions have been amazing. This has been really nice.
Yeah, well, thank you all so much for hanging out with us today and being random on a Friday. Sami, thank you for your genius, your energy, and your clarity of thought. It was just really wonderful to see how you think through the process and to guide people through the pathway to experimentation nirvana. So on that note, if everybody could drop a thank you or a virtual round of applause, we would love that. And again, hope to see everybody next week for Dan Ariely. So everybody take care and have a brilliant weekend. Or if you're in Australia, keep enjoying your weekend. Take care. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.